Hi everyone, welcome back to this AZ-900 Azure Fundamentals training. If this series is helping you learn Azure, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next lessons. In the previous lessons, you learned about core Azure compute, storage, and networking services. We covered virtual machines, app service, containers, functions, storage options like blob, disk, files, and queues, and networking basics like virtual networks, subnets, VPN, and ExpressRoute. In this lesson, we will focus on database services in Azure. By the end of this video, you will be able to describe the main Azure database options for the AZ-900 exam, including Azure SQL Database, Azure Cosmos DB, and other managed database services. You will also understand when to use each option in typical exam scenarios. Here is what we will cover in this lesson. First, we will review the difference between relational and non-relational, NoSQL, databases. Second, we will look at Azure SQL Database as a managed relational database service. Third, we will explore Azure Cosmos DB as a globally distributed, multi-model database service. Fourth, we will briefly introduce other managed database options, such as Azure SQL Managed Instance and Azure Database for PostgreSQL and MySQL. Finally, we will map exam-style scenarios to the right database service. Let's start with relational versus non-relational databases. A relational database stores data in tables with rows and columns, and uses structured query language, or SQL, to query and manage that data. Relational databases enforce relationships and constraints between tables, which helps maintain data integrity. Examples of relational database systems include Microsoft SQL Server, PostgreSQL, MySQL. Relational databases are a good fit when your data is structured, and relationships between entities are important, such as in financial systems, inventory, and traditional business applications. A non-relational or NoSQL database is more flexible in how it stores data. Instead of tables and rows, it might use documents, key-value pairs, graphs, or wide column structures. NoSQL databases are often used when you need flexible schemas, high scalability and global distribution, handling large volumes of data with varying structure. Examples of NoSQL systems include document databases, key-value stores, and graph databases. For the AZ-900 exam, you should recognize that relational databases use tables and SQL, while non-relational databases offer more flexible data models. Now, let's look at Azure SQL Database. Azure SQL Database is a fully managed relational database service in Azure, based on the Microsoft SQL Server engine. It provides a database as a service model, where Azure manages the infrastructure, operating system, and database engine for you. With Azure SQL Database, you do not install or patch SQL Server yourself. Azure handles backups, patching and updates, high availability features, basic monitoring and management. You focus on your database schema, queries, and data. Azure SQL Database supports familiar SQL features, such as T-SQL queries, stored procedures, and transactions. It also provides built-in capabilities like automatic backups and restore, scaling options for compute and storage, high availability within a region and, optionally, across regions. Typical use cases for Azure SQL Database include line of business applications, web apps that need a relational backend, migrating existing SQL Server databases to a managed service in Azure. In AZ-900 scenarios, if you see relational database, use SQL or managed SQL database in Azure without managing the OS. The correct answer is often Azure SQL Database. Now, let's talk about Azure Cosmos DB. Azure Cosmos DB is a fully managed, globally distributed, multi-model database service. Globally distributed means that you can replicate your data across multiple Azure regions around the world, with low latency and high availability. Multi-model means Cosmos DB supports several data models, including document for JSON documents, key value, graph, column family. Different APIs are available, such as the SQL API for JSON documents, the MongoDB API, the Cassandra API, the Gremlin API for graph data, and the Table API. Cosmos DB is designed for low latency access to data at global scale, high availability and throughput, applications that must serve users in many regions with minimal delay. You can configure Cosmos DB to replicate data to multiple regions. And the service provides multi-master capabilities, so you can read and write data in any configured region. Typical use cases for Cosmos DB include large-scale web and mobile applications, IoT and telemetry data, personalized, globally distributed applications, scenarios that require flexible schemas and high throughput. In AZ-900 exam questions, if you see requirements like global distribution, low latency at a global scale, multi-region writes, or NoSQL, JSON documents, the correct answer is often Azure Cosmos DB. Now let's briefly look at other managed database options in Azure. In addition to Azure SQL Database and Cosmos DB, Azure offers several managed database services for popular database engines. Examples include Azure SQL Managed Instance, which provides a managed SQL Server instance with high compatibility for on-premises SQL Server features. Azure Database for PostgreSQL, a fully managed PostgreSQL database service. Azure Database for MySQL, a fully managed MySQL database service. These services allow you to use familiar open-source database engines, while Azure takes care of infrastructure, patches, backups, and basic high availability. Typical use cases are organizations that already use PostgreSQL or MySQL and want to move to a managed service in Azure without changing database engines. Applications that require specific features of these engines, but benefit from Azure's platform management. For AZ-900, you don't need to know deep configuration details, but you should recognize that Azure provides managed services for these popular database engines, so you do not have to run them manually in virtual machines. Let's now map a few exam-style scenarios. To the right, Azure Database Service. Scenario 1. A company wants to migrate an existing SQL Server database to Azure and wants a fully managed relational database without managing virtual machines or the database engine. The best fit is Azure SQL Database. Scenario 2. An organization needs a globally distributed, low-latency database for a high-traffic web application with users in multiple regions, and they plan to store JSON documents and scale throughput dynamically. The best fit is Azure Cosmos DB. Scenario 3. A team uses PostgreSQL on-premises and wants to move to Azure while keeping the same database engine, but they no longer want to manage backups and patching. The best fit is Azure Database for PostgreSQL. Scenario 4. A company needs a managed SQL Server environment in Azure with high compatibility for on-premises SQL Server features, including SQL Agent and cross-database queries. The best fit is Azure SQL Managed Instance. If you practice recognizing these patterns, database-related questions in AZ-900 become much easier. Let's recap what you learned in this lesson. You reviewed the difference between relational and non-relational databases. You learned that Azure SQL Database is a fully managed relational database as a service based on the SQL Server engine, where Azure manages the infrastructure and database platform, and you focus on data and schema. You saw that Azure Cosmos DB is a globally distributed, multi-model database service designed for low-latency access to data at global scale and supporting multiple APIs and data models. You also learned that Azure offers managed database services for engines like PostgreSQL, MySQL, and SQL Server managed instance. So you can use familiar databases without managing the underlying infrastructure. These database services are key components for building modern, data-driven applications on Azure. If this lesson helped you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. To support the content and to follow the next lessons in this AZ-900 series. In the upcoming playlists, we will move into Azure management, governance, security, and cost-related topics, so that you have a complete view of Azure fundamentals for the exam. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.